All right, friends, welcome to another Blazor Power Hour. I'm Ed Charbonneau, and with me today is my good friend, Sam Basu. How you doing, Sam?
I am good.
What we're here today to talk about Blazor, and I have a talk that I give called the Blazor Component Artisan, and the idea behind the talk is to introduce folks that are new to Blazor to a little more than like that architectural overview that you normally get. Like you always see a lot of Blazor presentations that start with like the hello world, click the button and increment the counter type of thing, but nobody really deep dives into the component part until much later. So this is like a beginner's, but for components. And Sam, you do a lot of work in the mobile space with Xamarin and Maui these days, and we're getting to have like a blur between Blazor and mobile development. So I thought I'd invite you on and show you some things.
Yeah, things are overlapping. And like you said, the web component model may be the biggest thing that we end up sharing, because now all of it is welcome on native stuff.
Yeah, and Blazor in itself, like everything in Blazor is a component, right? Almost everything is literally a component. And if you know the architecture of components really well, then you can be a very successful Blazor developer. So I want to dive into kind of the bits and pieces of what that is today. And I'm doing this in part with Manning as well. So I have a brand new Manning Live project. What's interesting about Manning Live projects are that they have sort of a feel of you're part of a development team. You're working on an actual job, like on the job training kind of. And the workshop somewhat guides you through what to do, but you're kind of challenged along the way as well to find your own solutions to problems. And because it's Manning, of course, you get some of the Manning materials with it. So one of the things that accompanies this live project is the book by Chris Santee called Blazor in Action. So you can read through the books and find material online as well to try to solve these problems that are given to you throughout the 4 project series that teaches you how to build, test, and do state management and authentication with Blazor. So if you get a chance, check that out on manning.com. That's under live projects, and it's called Build Web Apps with Blazor. So the thing we're going to focus on today, Sam, is a little bit of what's covered in Project 1, but it's kind of like a behind the scenes view of what you would learn there. So I've got a Visual Studio project all prepped and ready to go here, so we can learn a little bit about the Blazor component model. How's that sound, Sam?
Yeah, sounds good.
So just for starters, let's take a look at the solution that I've got here. And I've tried to clear this out actually and make this about as bare bones as I can, just so we can focus on the exact things that we want to do today. So if we dive into Solution Explorer, we've got just a web project here. We're not going to worry about like the server solution part of a Blazor app. This is a Blazor WebAssembly app, but for all intents and purposes, this stuff works whichever hosting model you're using, because we're just talking about components specifically today. We've got a pages folder, and this is where all of your routable components generally live. So anything that has a page route or URL you can get to, those components usually go under here. But notice I said components because all pages are actually just components with a route directive. And on my index page here, you can see one of those route directives. But this is a component. All of this is a component here. The only thing that makes it routable is this little bit here called a directive. So under pages, that's where we've got the index, and that's about it. I don't have any other components in this app, really. There are some services here that are going to help us just with some data. They're not really important at this point, but just these are just some preloaded fake services that I can use to gather some data later for some examples down the road. And that's it. It's pretty basic from there. And this is just what we're going to cover today. I'll go ahead and run the app just so we can take a look and see what we're starting with. And this is our agenda, Sam. I'm going to teach you a little bit about components. We'll talk a little bit about CSS isolation. We'll add some parameters to the components, and then we'll talk about data-driven components that have child content, type parameters, and templates, and then we'll do a little event delegation. All right? Mm-hmm. Okay. The last time I checked, I was able to get the hot reload feature working in this pretty well. So if you're new to .NET or maybe just .NET 6, hot reload is a very cool feature that allows the app to dynamically reload the page that you're working with or the components that you're working with. So if I come in here and make a change, you'll see it's live updating the web view in the browser here. So that seems to be working good, and we're going to want to take advantage of that. There are some times where we create new components and things that it might ask us to restart the application and stuff. But for all intents and purposes, we could probably get away with not having to restart this app very often.
The when you did the update to the agenda, you saw that little check mark. Is that a Blazor specific thing?
I believe this is a web, web specific thing. So Blazor has other ways of developing for like mobile and stuff through Blazor Hybrid. I don't know if you get that experience with Blazor Hybrid, but for Blazor and Webassembly and Blazor Server, yeah, you get that little check mark in the browser. I think it's more of a browser, specific thing that happens with Blazor. I take it Maui doesn't have the little check mark that shows up.
We just assume it is updating.
You just assume. Now, I will give you all out there that are watching a little heads up. Just because it shows the check does not 100% of the time mean that it actually did what it was supposed to do. You may get like a false positive every once in a while. You'll see the check and you'll be like, I'm pretty sure what I did should have changed the style or added something to this, and it's just not there. Do yourself a favor, just reboot the app and give yourself a quick check and make sure that it, maybe you did do it wrong, but 9 times out of 10, it's like it gave you the check, but it didn't quite recompile some asset in the background. So don't always rely on that check mark, but it's usually pretty good.
So I'm guessing Blazor will also handle like regular .NET hot reload, which is your C# edits. And how does it handle like any dependency injection type things that you might change? I mean, there's some edge cases, right?
There are things called rude edits, and you can sometimes see those come up in the console here. It will say that you need to reload the app to see the changes that you made. And you may see those similar warnings come up in the editor as well. But generally, unless it's a big code change, you're adding like a new interface to something, like you said, dependency injection sometimes will cause that to happen. But if it's markup related, then usually it's going to reload. Adding a brand new file is going to cause you to need to reload the application. That's kind of a rude edit. You've added a whole new class to the app, that sort of thing. It is worth mentioning too, while I said a class to the app, when you add a component like Razor Index here, behind the scenes, Blazor is compiling this Razor view into a .NET class. So you don't actually see that code, but you can imagine a index.cs file being generated behind the scenes. So these are classes that we're working with. So if you add a new component, even if it's just got some markup in it and it doesn't look like it's a C# class, it is. Okay.
So if you actually had to hand code index.razor.cs, that's the reason why it always has to be partial, I'm guessing, because like it has to combine with the rest of the class that Blazor is doing.
Yeah, so the thing that Sam's referring to is a like code behind. So you can split your code, which we don't have a code block yet, but when we get one, we can talk about it a little bit more. You could split your code off into another file, and you have to use a partial class because C# is generating a class for this component, and if you give a class the same name as the component, there's a conflict between those two names. So the compiler can't generate that anymore. You have to use a partial, so the compiler knows to kind of merge those two things together. And we have some folks joining us in live chat, which is awesome. This is a live show, so feel free to ask questions. And let's kind of dive in a little bit, Sam. So let's make our first component. All right. One thing I might want to do is get this agenda out of our way, just in our index page here, just so we can work a little bit easier. So I'm going to go over to my solution here and create a components folder so we can start putting some of this stuff somewhere. So I'm going to create a new folder and we'll call it components. And in our components folder, I'm going to right click here and say add new Razor component. And this little dialog's just going to help us stub out a component. It usually comes up with component.razor in here, and we'll call this one agenda.razor. And then I'll go back to my index page and just cut the HTML off of there and just paste it over this index.razor. You can see the hot reload kick in and kind of wipe out that index page. I did say earlier that hot reload might need us to reload the app as we add new components in. We'll have to test that theory here in just a second, because we did add this agenda.razor component here. So if I come over to my index page now, I should be able to use agenda in here. And notice when I start typing, I've got this really long name that starts showing up, but it does show you that the compiler sees that component, but it sees it under this really long namespace. It says Blazor Component Artisan components.agenda. So the namespace that it's getting here is derived from the project name. So this is the project name and then the folder and then the name of the component. So Blazor Component Artisan .components.agenda. So it does take on the namespace of that folder that you put your component in. So when I start typing this out, you're going to get that really long named component here. Matter of fact, it's so big you can't see it all on one page. So that's something we're immediately going to want to fix. But we should be able to save this, and there's our agenda again. And it didn't need us to reload the monitor either. Or not reload the monitor, reload the application. I was looking away at my chat on my other monitor. Little brain fog there.
So you like calling it components, like you would have a folder called components and not pages, because like pages are essentially components. Like,
well, all pages are components, but not all components are pages.
Sure, you can have multiple components in a page.
You can have multiple components in a page, but essentially the rule of thumb here, and you can name these things whatever you want. Pages is just something that's kind of common. You're going to see this pretty often in any documentation and samples that you're going to run into. You could organize this by feature if you'd like, and then have subfolders under each feature that has the components that belong to the top level page. But essentially anything that's in that pages folder has a route attached to it. So a page directive and a URL that we're going to route to. Components, again, is awful generic as well. So sometimes I'll start with components, and then as I start building out features, they'll get moved into other folders that are more specific to what that component does, what feature it controls. Maybe these are all part of a shopping cart. That might be called, the shopping cart components folder, and then all the stuff that has to deal with shopping carts goes in it. But then there's generic things that just kind of belong anywhere, like a button isn't specific to any type of a feature in the app. If I'm going to have some kind of a button, then that's just going to be components, kind of in a general components folder. Or I might get that from a third-party library.
Quick question in the chat room. This is all, cross-platform. Tooling has come a long way, so you'll have the exact same experience on Visual Studio on a Mac or VS Code on a Mac. It's the same templates, same exact thing.
Yeah. Mileage may vary on like how the IDE works, but the code is going to be exactly the same. Some of the templates are just located in different places in the IDE, or you might have to jump over to the command line to execute something. But other than that, you're pretty close to the same experience. So we've got our component here on the index page. We move that agenda off into its own component, but we have this long namespace that we're stuck with. Now, we could just come up to the top of the page here and say using and drop in a using statement, just like we would in a C# file. And we would put it in like this. And notice it still recognizes our agenda component here. And now anything that is in that components folder, we can use on this index.razor page. However, most of the time in an app, you've got multiple pages that are using these namespaces. And it's kind of annoying to have to write this namespace out with the using statement on every single page that you're using. In C# 10, .NET 6, C# 10, we have the concept of a global using statement. Have you played around with those at all, Sam?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
We've had that in Razor for many years now. So this is a new feature to C#, but in the ASP.NET side of things, we've actually had this for quite some time, and this exists in Blazor as well. So we can take that using statement and go to an imports.razor file. It's always preceded by a little underscore here. This is by convention. This imports.razor file is similar to a global using that you would see in C# classes. So you could think of it as the global using statement, but in this is all for components and components only. So we can drop our using statement in there, and then we don't have to specify that on the index page anymore. So that's pretty cool. So now we've got our agenda here, and then I don't know if this is something that works in the XAML world, Sam, but if you don't have some kind of child content or inner HTML, we might like to call it, so some type of content that goes in here in between the tags, we can use something called a self-closing tag. So this is a HTML concept that we can just bring over to our component. So I don't need to specify an end tag. There's not anything inside of it. And that actually means the same thing.
Same way in XAML. XAML
Right.
is HTML.
It is. It's got so many extra steps and symbols, though. I don't know. You'll have to show me sometime.
All right. Chat room is talking about, is WASI the same as, what is WASI?
So WebAssembly server implementation is, I can't remember if that's the exact acronym for it, but you can run WebAssembly on the server. So Blazor, one of Blazor's targets is WebAssembly. So there's a .NET runtime running on the browser, and all of your code executes within that WebAssembly runtime that .NET is running in. In order to make apps more portable, so you can use them on any type of platform, there is a WebAssembly implementation that you can run on the server outside of a browser. So they've basically taken the browser away now, and you've got WebAssembly running on its own, and you can host that independent of the operating system that you're using and so on. So it's really taking WebAssembly to the next level. It's a little bit beyond what we're talking about here today, but that's kind of the concept. Is like WebAssembly is going to kind of be its own runtime, for lack of a better term, in the future.
Interesting. Yeah, like Ed and me are old guys here, we have seen the flip-flop between server client, and yeah.
All right, so let's make something a little bit more complex than our agenda component here. Just kind of quickly point out, like, our agenda component literally has nothing but HTML in it at this point. The nice thing about this is I just encapsulated all of this HTML, and if I wanted to reuse this component somewhere, I could just specify another one, and now I've got, something that's easily repeatable, and I don't have to write that HTML ever again. So we kind of have the grasp of a simple component, but let's do one that has a little bit of a style to it. So let's create a component here that's going to be an alert box. So we might want to show like an alert, and inside of that alert, there's some alert content that we wrap inside of it. And right now that it's just a div. It's a container with just some text inside. So let's go ahead and add some style to this, and we'll say class equals alert, and alert to let's see, alert warning, I think is probably something that we might want to use, but notice there's still not anything happening. That's because we don't have any CSS yet. We've written a class name out here, but we haven't written any code to style this div container and make anything actually happen here. So we're going to have to do the unthinkable, Sam. That's write some CSS code. Normally, when you're doing web development, you might put that CSS code in your root here. Generally, if you're starting with Blazor template, you might actually have something like Bootstrap already installed for you. I took all of that out just so we can go bare bones here and learn all about components and not run into any black boxes. So I'm going to open up app.css here and just put in the style sheet that I want for an alert. So
our good friend Catherine is in the chat room. Hey, Catherine. Yes, CSS time. I tinker, like I would write a little bit of like CSS or less, because like now you can share this between web and native, and I'm scared. I don't do CSS very well.
So yeah, I added some CSS. Hot reload is working beautifully today, so I'm really happy about that. We've got the container here, the alert container, and there's some padding, border radius, and some border color. Just to kind of make this pop a little bit, and then we can change the various backgrounds here to different colors as well. So if I go back to my index page here, you might say alert.info, and that's going to change it to a nice blue color. This is not a component yet, though, so we're just kind of prototyping some HTML here.
I have some questions. I have some questions about this, but in the chat room, don't start World War III here.
Let's chat up to
with Tailwind being dead and so on.
Yeah, we could get into this another time, but so one positive thing I think I saw on Twitter the other day, somebody wrote a tool that will reverse engineer your Tailwind back into a CSS library based on how you used it, which sounds really interesting. So you could prototype with Tailwind and then go run this tool, and then get you can get what do you call it? Trying to think of the proper term for it. I want to say scoped CSS, but that's not it. It's shoot. You will get semantic CSS back. Yeah, it's basically vanilla. Yeah, semantic CSS back in a file that you can use. So I think that's interesting. But we're not going to dive into the whole CSS versus Tailwind stuff today. It's very opinionated. We won't go there. But we've got our alert. We've got some basic CSS classes that we can interchange to make different alerts. Matter of fact, let's just kind of throw a couple of those back down here, just so we can see what we're working with. We've got like a warning, and warning is danger. Spelling matters in CSS. Alert. Let's see, what were they all? Error, danger info. There we go. So there's our 3 shades of alert boxes that we're going to be working with.
All right, so hold up here for a second, because what you're doing, like when I, as a native developer, when I think about web components, we think about it as, an all encapsulating thing that you can just drop. So shouldn't a component include all of the markup and the C# and the CSS and any JavaScript all together in one spot?
Yes. So we're going to try to aim for that. That's the goal here. So right now we just have some HTML. We don't really have an alert component yet. We're just dropping this into our index razor. And we've got the CSS kind of in a global CSS file here. What we need to do now is kind of turn these into components. And we don't need 3 components to do all of these things. We can have one component that we can pass a parameter into that can kind of toggle the state of this look here, this style. So let's take this component or this HTML out and make another component. Let's go over to our components folder here. I'm going to right click again, hit add razor component, and then we can call this an alert box.razor. All right, so we've got our brand new component. I'll paste in that code. I'm going to leave the, see here, it's triggering a root edit. So it's saying you've added something that requires the app to restart. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it to go ahead and let me keep editing for a moment, because I'm going to make a couple more changes here. I'm going to come back and remove.
Can I pause you for just 1 second before you
sure.
That? That what you did with the 3 well, those are div tags. Those are not components yet. But let's just say you had an alert component. How expensive is it memory-wise to repeat components? Like, let's say I have one component that renders 1 row of a grid. Can I repeat that 1,000 times inside of a table? Or is that really bad?
All things do consume some sort of memory in Blazor, all components. So it depends on how complex those components are. If you have, say, thousands of components that are loading on a page, depending on what the scenario is, is it data that's causing all of these components to load? Are you data binding to all of those things? If so, I would say you want to use some sort of virtualization. So it looks like all of those things are loading to the user, but it's really just lazy loading them in as they view them. So that's a technique that you can use, but we're still in the early stages here, just learning about components. That's much more of a deep dive, expert level topic.
Yeah, sorry to get ahead, but
no, not a problem. It's a great question though. For most forms over data, most basic views, even simple dashboards, you're not going to need to worry about that. If you're doing some very data intensive display of thousands of records of data, then yeah, you're going to need some sort of virtualization, but that goes for any framework that's out there. React, Vue, all of those things, you should try to take that into account. Anytime you're feeding the user more data and more HTML than they can consume, it's a waste. Whether they're on a mobile device, they're wasting battery, or they may be wasting bandwidth, or maybe you're just wasting server resources querying all of these database records that no human could possibly view at one time. Waste is waste. You might be burning dollars on your Azure or AWS account, that sort of thing. Let's go ahead and kick these out of here, and then let's try to restart. I'm going to stop the server here from running. Something about the edit here makes it very unhappy. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to hit Control F5 here to do run without debugging again. I often run without debugging if I'm not debugging some specific problem, because it just executes a lot faster in my opinion. So you'll hear me say run without debugging quite a bit. It doesn't mean that you can't debug. It just means that I'm not in that mode of working on this yet. So we've we've got our alert box here, but for some reason, we are not rendering
you can restart the
an
app
alert on screen. Yeah, let's
You-
double check and make sure. I refresh the browser here. Let's do a rebuild. There it goes. So I've rebuilt the code. Like I said, we saw the check mark. I mentioned this early on. Saw the check mark, but it didn't update properly. So sometimes you do need to rebuild the application. All right. So there's our alert component. So we've got our alert. We could probably take this agenda off of here temporarily as well. We could always go look at that again in a moment. But let's focus in on our alert. So we've got our alert. We still can't add any content to it. Notice I used this self-closing tag again. We need to kind of open that guy up because we're going to be wanting to add something in the middle here in a minute so we can customize the message inside of the alert. We also have the same style. We don't have a way of setting a style. And speaking of styles, we're still using that global style that we created in app.css. And you asked a little bit about this already, Sam. The problem with keeping it here in app.css is that somebody could come in underneath of this and just kind of override that alert style and kind of mess things up. Maybe you have a rigid style system in place, a theme at your company you're working for, and you don't want somebody to accidentally, override the brand coloring or a specific, theme that you've got going on, that sort of thing. So we could isolate our component's style away from this global value here by taking our CSS code and moving it to a specific file. So I'm going to cut this out and hot reload immediately, taking that out of the app there. We're going to come over to components, and I'm going to add a new item. It's important that you add a new item. If you accidentally hit the Razor component here, it's going to change your file extension for you. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure you're selecting this style sheet template, just so it doesn't throw the wrong suffix at the end of it. And we want to call this alertbox.razor.css. So if we look at this, it's got the name of the component. It specifies it's for the Razor, Blazor framework, and then CSS at the end, specifying that this is a style sheet. And what this is going to do is associate this style sheet with that component. And in Visual Studio, you can actually see it nest these two things together. So you can see all we've done is taken the file name of the component and appended .css on the end. And that's going to bundle the things together. And we need to kind of update our, rebuild our project one more time there. So hot reload can only take it so far, and you just need to rebuild the app sometimes. But now I can't inadvertently override any of the CSS that's in the component. The way that works is the compiler adds a little bit of magic to it. So I'm going to go into the debugging tools in the browser here, and let's see if I can zoom in on, there we go. There's our alert. And then if we look at the code for the alert, the CSS code has this weird thing attached to it. So we've got this ID kind of that's been appended to that CSS code, and it does the same thing for the HTML that corresponds to that CSS code. So if you look at the HTML it generated, there's that same ID right there. So that gives it a very narrow scope for the CSS to be applied to only components that have that ID. So that isolates them.
So, yeah, no, this is good. But if I wanted my page to customize a component, I could not just use the same CSS class then.
Correct. Yeah, this is meant to actually prevent that from happening. So if you want something to be altered like that, you could bubble up kind of a property here. Yeah, and I'll show you a little bit how to do that. So let's say we want to do some basic customization that's still within the scope of the isolated CSS. So we want the user to be able to select one of these three classes here: the alert info, alert error, alert danger. This could even leave them open to creating their own one of these with their own naming conventions behind it. So you could say, maybe I have an alert that's not one of these three, just some other sort of info or grayed out, disabled maybe a good one. So you might have alert dash disabled. That's not part of this isolation, but you can still add this functionality to your component using this method. So we want to let the user change this bit here. So we're going to talk about the next thing on our agenda, which is parameters. So we're going to do some I/O between our component and the application. So to do that, we're going to specify a property. And that property needs to be public. And for this instance, we're going to use string. And we'll call this one CSS class. And we want to make this an actual parameter that we can access on our index page here when we're using the component. When we create an instance of the component, we want to be able to put that property up here in the component's definition and access that property. To do that, we need to add an attribute here called parameter. So once we have a parameter and it's a public property, then we can come into the instance of that component and say CSS class equals alert-info and pass in a string here. Now that CSS property isn't being used anywhere yet. We'll just take a little bit of razor markup and just write out that class right here. So this is just going to inject the string that's defined right here. It'll take this value and inject it right there in the markup. So now we can set that CSS class externally from the component. So we've done that on our index.razor. So we'll go ahead and run the app again, and it should be info here. If we come in here and change this to danger, that was not one of our values. Warning, was it? Or is it hot reload? That's not happy again. Hot reload is... Yeah, hot reload, again, it's not always a win. So...
We have a term for it. It's called warm,
yeah,
exactly. Warm.
Exactly, right here. Chat has it, lukewarm reload. This is a good thing to point out, though, here on the stream, because they're going to carry this over to the Manning content that I was talking about earlier. And if you're troubleshooting your app using the live project, you might run into this. So yeah, just reload or recompile your app, and it should take care of those issues for you. All right.
Yeah, foolish Neville, don't even go there.
So we've got our CSS parameter now.
Okay, I have a question. It's a dumb question, but when you are not self-closing a component on your page, you're free to add whatever you want inside of the component, right? Like just the way you had the alert component on the page, back on the page. I mean, could a user add whatever they want to a component?
So that's a great question. We'll get there in just 1 second, because you can do that, and there are some instances where it will work and some where it will not work. So first thing I want to address before we get on to that is the fact that this is another C# feature that's fairly new, and it's the non-nullable properties. there you go. It's let me zoom now. It says non-nullable property must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. Consider declaring the property is nullable. So there's a lot of strict handling of nulls now in the C# language, and those have filtered into Razor because it is C#. And there are some times where this matters, and there's a lot of times where it does not. Okay. If we ignore the fact that this can be null, it's not going to crash our application if we don't set this property. It's not going to cause a compiler error. It's not going to cause a runtime error. It's just going to cause the alert to not have a background. It's not the end of the world. Our app didn't crash. There's no, log that's created. The user keeps on chugging for the most part. We're just talking about some colors that weren't applied. It's not the end of the world. So sometimes they seem like false negatives here, but we can improve this a little bit. So one thing that we could do is just specify a default here. And just say if somebody doesn't specify that this is one of those three values, we'll just call it alert danger by default. And there you can see it falling back to alert danger, and it also clears up that nullable that we were talking about. And then in that same regard, you're talking about adding content to the body of a component here. And what we normally call this is child content. In HTML, you might call this inner HTML. In Razor or Blazor, we call this child content. And it kind of loaded for a second there, and then it threw an error. Okay, so let's take a look at the error and see what's going on. And I did this intentionally so we can learn a little bit. It says unhandled exception rendering component object of type, and then it says it's an alert box, doesn't have a property matching the name child content. So anytime you try to add a property to a component that doesn't exist, let me take this off here for a moment so it can recover from the error. Let's say, for example, we have a parameter in here, CSS class, right? What if we came in and specified a parameter called Sam?
Oh no, I'm getting into code here.
And we call it, give it a property of code it live. We just generated an error again. If we zoom in here on the error, it's going to look exactly the same. So it says object of type alert box does not have a property matching Sam. So we've created a parameter that doesn't exist.
I mean, that's a parameter. That's understandable why it's speaking on that. But if you're talking a component that's rendering HTML, why could you not add on something inside of it?
Okay. So the example I just gave of adding Sam here triggers the same error message as adding some content here. The reason for that is because the way Blazor handles that child content is through parameters. And when I add something here, I'm actually creating or setting a parameter called child content that doesn't exist on the component. So now we can take a look at how we can add that child content behavior. And as I said, that is a parameter. So the first thing we need to do is add a parameter. And then this is going to be again, all parameters must be public. And then we need a special class called a render fragment. Now, a render fragment is any HTML, any component, any web stuff that we want to put inside of this container. So any child content is going to be a render fragment. And then I'll call it child content. This is a convention. That's why that error said that child content was not a defined parameter, because it's a convention it was looking for, but we didn't have a parameter to satisfy it. And we'll call get set on that one. And again, we're going to get this nullable thing. And the nullable here is just erroneous as can be, because if there's no child content, it's just not going to render anything. So I'm saying you can ignore that if you want to. Now, to write this child content where we want it to be rendered in the markup, we'll come back to the markup and just say child content here. And then it's going to ask me to reload the app. Hot reload's getting in the way more than it is helping at this point. So we've got our child content, and notice there's nothing in our alert anymore. That's because if we go back to our alert, we don't have anything here. We can say hot reload. For the love of hot reload. All right, there we go. So there we go. There's your child content. We can put anything we want here. We can even do like an alert inception here. If we wanted to really go here, just to show you that components can be inside of other components.
So is this a way, like if you had like a design system to have like, you know, a parent-child relationship where things just, you know, trickle down and you inherit, you know, you have, you know, for every component you bring in the styles and you're kind of hand guiding something to be styled or presented as in a certain way. You make them like child components and then you let the users of your components inject whatever they want inside within some parameters, guidelines.
Exactly. You can do that. So you'll see in like Telerik UI for Blazor, you'll have a data grid, and the data grid might have an optional toolbar, for example. You can, or columns that you need to render. So there'll be subcomponents under their child components that belong in certain template regions, and those help build out functionality in the component, so you can kind of mix and match these things like Legos.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the agenda here has taken on the look and feel of that alert box it's inside of. So we can utilize this for all sorts of things. Now, I do want to point out, and let me try to kill this hot reload because it's just getting in the way and kind of being annoying. Maybe if I reboot the whole thing, it'll stop doing that. So we've got our alert box. It's worth pointing this out, and we'll talk about this more in the next little bit here. But this child content is an implicit thing. So just by design, this child content tag is implicit, which means we don't have to specify it. And that is when the component only has one render fragment defined. So if there is one and only one render fragment, you can call it child content by convention, and you do not have to specify this inner tag that tells it this is the child content. However, if you have multiple render fragments, say you have a header template and a content template and a footer template, they would all have their own names. So you might have content template as the name instead of child content. We'd also need to reflect that here. You would have to explicitly write that out. Content template. And then you could have multiple of these. You might have a header and a footer that goes along with it, and then the component will render those where they're, you know, where that content is appropriate. So you can have multiple regions inside of a component for the user to add their own HTML or other components to.
What would happen if you specified two right in here? Because you only have a placeholder for one content template, but what if you mentioned another tag, another content template, like not in the component itself, like back on your page? If you repeat it,
you'll get an error in here if you try to use more than one.
I see. All right. But if you did not have the explicit thing, if you just wanted some, I mean, take out the content template. What if you just added another line? Would it treat that as one component then? Like, hello world Sam, let's just do another line or another piece of content somewhere in here. That's one component then. Or
still one component. This is all one child content. Now, this actually will cause an error at runtime because we've gone away from the implicit child content and called it content template. So we actually have to specify the term content template there.
But if you did the implicit child, then that's okay. Repeating whatever you want without calling it out.
Yeah, because those two separate lines are still just one stream of HTML. They're not two separate definitions. They're not two child contents. So we've got that. I'll show you how to take more advantage of those templates in just a sec. And we've got the ability to change the look and feel of this through that CSS property. So we've got our two properties here. We've still got this lingering null thing. Let's look at that for a second. If we wipe the text out of this, and let's try to get this reload working again. This is the proper rendering here. So there's nothing inside of this alert box. It's null. The child content property is completely null at this point. And notice it's not crashing our application. There's, it's not an end of the world scenario, but we still have this warning that's kind of just meaningless. There's a couple ways we can solve this. The Blazor framework is handling this gracefully by not blowing up. So we don't really have to do anything, but if we want to get rid of that warning, we could say default here with a bang symbol. And this is telling the compiler that we're accepting the fact that this can initialize to the default value, and that may be null. So we're allowing that null. We're saying as a developer here, this is okay. Stop warning me.
Yeah, the bang operator is interesting. Can you have you ever used something like what Foolish Campbell was pointing out, like Nullable Disable? Is that something you can use at a global level and just not have it complain?
You can disable it. I wouldn't recommend it though, because it is going to disable it for non-Razor code, which nulls can really be bad for. Razor handles these probably 50% of the time gracefully. There are things that you can write that can cause issues, so you should take notice to it. But for certain things, it's not going to cause a problem. If there's some kind of logic running against these values before it's displayed in the Razor code, that's when you can run into some issues. If you're just setting the property and displaying it here, generally you're not going to run into any problems. Another way you could solve this is through the question mark operator here. So you could say this is a nullable property. So this is also saying it's okay that it is null, and we have ways of handling it if it is null.
What
so
is
this kind of kicks the can down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So this says if it's null, then if we write code against child content somewhere, when we write that code, we're going to have to inspect for null and make sure that we're handling it in that scenario. Where the other usage, we just flat out ignored it completely. We're like, it's fine if it's null. So chat is debating whether this is the right approach or not. It's a matter of how it's being used.
Can you write like null with a bang? Can you do that instead of the default?
You can write null with the bang here. So there's a difference between null and default. So some classes have a default that they resolve to. I can't remember the specifics off the top of my head, which ones default to a certain value. If there isn't a default, then it will be null. And if that class's default is null, then it's the same as saying null. So it kind of goes down a big rabbit hole of things that we don't have time to discuss, but you can solve it in these two different ways. This, depending on what the class is and what you're doing, this might be the more correct way. Setting a default might be proper, or just ignoring it for certain things. Child content, generally, you're just taking whatever is input here and just displaying it. And if it's null, it's just not going to do anything, as the example shown on the right. So for child content and render fragment, the default bang is just as valid, I think, as throwing a question mark on the end. That's just my opinion of it. So you can resolve those that way. So let's look at our agenda again real quick. So we talked about child content. Let's talk about templates more in depth. We talked about like the child content's implicit. We can set explicit templates. We get more than one of them. What if we wanted data binding with repeating templates? Okay, that's what I want to talk about next. So we're going to need some data for this. I already have a server, sorry, not a server, a service implementation here that's going to give us some data. I won't go through all the service stuff. It's the same across all .NET of how to do dependency injection and get services registered. What's not common between all of the frameworks is how you get this service injected. So I'm going to inject it with a directive. This is a very Blazor-y thing. I'm going to say @inject, and this is going to say to dependency injection, get me an implementation of some service and inject it into the component. And in here, I've got a logger service, and I'm going to name it logs. So now I've taken a logger service instance and set it to a property called logs. And if I come into my alert box, I can say you have for a razor. I'm going to type some code here. logs.log items.count. And then I'll say logs. And this is one thing I like about the razor syntax, Sam. You can do these inline data binding and you can call it data binding, like one-way data binding here, and just write it out in the middle of a string. So if I save this and we'll get this going again. It says you have 25 logs. So it's actually taken that service, counted the number of log items in it, written it out to the page here, and put it inside of that string of text.
Yeah,
pretty nice.
It's cool. I see what you're doing. I just feel like, I have thoughts about dependency injection and registering services, like especially coming in from .NET MAUI. Xamarin Forms did not do dependency injection. Now we have kind of learned to swivel completely the other way. So I see the Blazor's way of injecting things, but maybe the more consistent way of doing it in the .NET dependency injection kind of assumes that you can use it in everywhere, not just for Blazor for web, because then you can use it in WPF or MAUI or other places. I can use these services anywhere. It's just the way that components inject that service is through this inject statement. Now, normally in C#, what you would see is a constructor, and the injection would come through the constructor of that class. Since the compiler is handling the generation of the class for us, you don't see the constructor of the component. So there's not a constructor method here. Right. Even if we get into code blocks, which we're actually going to need here soon, even if we were to write a code block, you don't see a constructor here to get the dependency injection in it. Not only that, this dependency injection in a component in Blazor happens at a different life cycle than it would in a typical class. That's because the components are rendered to the browser, and they go through this life cycle where
the data and the service might not be available at the time it's rendering, and there's an actual lifecycle method, several that you might need to attach some functionality to make that happen. So the inject parameter handles some of that for you, and then you may need to do some work with it. But it's more like a property injection, which Thindle's actually saying here in chat. So when you're doing code behind, you actually write this as a property injector. And it makes a lot more sense when you look at the full life cycle of how all these things happen.
Yeah, this is very Blazor specific because everything else, like in like .NET Mavi, we will always do constructor injection. Yeah,
the resolution of the dependency is very Blazor specific. The creating it is the same. If we take a quick jump into the program CS file, you'll see that we're just injecting services how we would in any other modern .NET application. So DI is built in to .NET these days, and we just call builder services, and we add it with the lifetime scope that we need. We'll get into specifics on all of those, but we have it available to the app, and then we use inject to get it in to the component as a property. Now, we've counted out the number of logs. Let's create a data binding component that can take a list of items and display those. So we can kind of iterate over things, because what I want to do is put all of these log items in an alert box, and I don't want to have to sit here and write out a bunch of components. I want a component that can just take the data and handle that on its own. So I'll add a new Razor component here, and we will call this alert list.razor. So we have an alert list razor here, and boy, it's pulling up some old cache here. It just went straight back to the agenda page there. Boy, hot reload is really interesting today. It likes to do fun stuff while you're live streaming for sure. So we've got, yeah. You know what? Let me close the browser and let's reboot that whole thing. Let's fire that back up.
Ed, you're making good progress here with your agenda, but I do have to run in about 10 minutes. I got another meeting.
All right. We'll move this along. If I could just get the browser back up. Hot reload is very sticky today. Let's close that guy. Control F5 again. There we go. It's back. It's showing its true colors today. All right. So we want an alert list. So what we can do here is we'll take advantage of something called type param. And type param is kind of another Blazor-y thing, right? Oops. And what type param does is, remember, these things all get compiled into a class, right? So we have alert. And that is, an alert is a component, a class. So we'll just kind of pseudocode this out. So when the compiler creates the alert, it's an alert box, right? That's our component. And that's the class it makes. You can even see it says right here, class of Blazor Component Artisan alert box. What T-item does is it lets you create a component of T, like that. So I'm basically creating a typed component. And that typed component is going to give me some syntactic sugar that makes for some interesting things that I can do with data binding. So I'm going to create a alert list of T item. And I know you're running close on time here, Sam, so we'll make this pretty quick by just pasting in some code here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate. So I'm waiting for my monitor to catch up here. I just lost one of them. In a second, it'll come back. I've got my type parameter of t item, and then down here I have a render fragment of t item. So this type is going to flow through the parameters of my component as well. So I have a render fragment of t item, and that's going to be my item template. And then I have a list. This could be any collection, by the way, but this is just simple to create a read-only list of t item, and that's going to take multiple items. So when I bind this items property, this for each loop will go over each item in that collection, render an alert box, and then it's going to render the template. And unlike, remember the child content before, we didn't specify any type of parameter with it or argument. Because this is a render fragment of t item, we're actually going to pass in an argument here, which is the item. So every time this for each iterates over the render fragment, it's going to pass in the item from the collection to it and render that item template out. So we can go back to our alert box here and say alert list, or sorry, index page. And we can say items equals logs dot log items. And we'll go ahead and just close that. Nope, we need to actually specify a template. We'll specify the template in here, and then this is called item template. Remember, it's not child content, so we actually have to write this explicitly out here. And then we'll use something called context. And when I say context, the context is whatever the data binding was. So this is going to be a log item coming from our collection of log items. This alert list is generic. I could bind any type of list here, but this one happens to be log items. So the context here is within that for each loop, when I'm creating that template, the current item is the context. So a log item is here, and when I type my dot here, you'll see IntelliSense come up with the properties of that log item. So for example, I could say ID here. We'll say the template is an H2 tag with the content ID, and then paragraph tag with the content or context of message. And then that's in the hot reload once again. We'll rerun this one.
So I get all of this, but I mean, yeah, no, it's nice.
So there's all of your items there.
Mm-hmm. Did you have to do the T though? Like what if you just like had a strongly typed?
You can create a strongly typed component. So what I generally do, and you'll see this if you check out the Manning Live project, is I will create a generic component and then wrap that generic component inside a domain-specific component. So I might have a grid, for example, a data grid that is very generic in nature. It can take any type of item. So it's a T item data grid. Then I'll wrap that data grid in something like a shopping cart component and say that it can only take a list of shopping cart items. And then internally it will use that generic table, a data grid, to display the data. So you can abstract these things out to make them very reusable, but then put them in domain-specific things and kind of give opinions on how that component should be used. So I might have a generic grid component, but then I might have a shopping cart grid component or a product grid component that takes a very specific type.
Makes sense.
It's all a matter of how flexible you want that component to be. And you may get there one of two ways. You might start domain specific and then realize, oh, I need this in other places. Then you can abstract away the generic part of it. Or you might start generic and then realize you might need specific pieces that that have more domain knowledge. So that's how you do list-bound data. Like you want to take a collection of some sort and repeat a template over and over. Is you use these patterns here. For each, we've got our render fragment, and that render fragment takes a type, and then we can repeat that render fragment over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the same idea as how XAML does templating. So we will have a data template and an item template and a cell template, and then you repeat that as many times. So you're defining the structure of it essentially inside of the template, then you data bind and you repeat. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I know you have to go, Sam, but I'll sit here with chat for a little bit longer and answer some questions, because it looks like Janescu says, what about a templated alerts with the CSS class based on the color of the log? So we can actually do that with a little bit of functional programming.
Yeah. So Ed, why don't you do that? Have fun. I will hop onto my other meeting. But this was good because I learned a bunch of things about how the intricacies of the internal component system works. So this is good stuff.
Yep. Thanks for joining me, Sam. And I'll have to have you on again sometime. We'll keep going here for a few more minutes, and we've got some questions coming in. I wanted to show some handling of events through the event delegation system here too. So let's look at events really quick, and then Thindle, I will take on your question of how do we adapt the CSS classes. There's two ways we could actually do that. One is through functional programming, which is probably a road less taken, but I really like. The other is just through some CSS tricks that we could employ here, which is my less preferred, but usually the road more taken by developers and component vendors. So we'll look at that as well. So the first thing is I want to be able to manage my log items, and I want to add a delete function to my alert list here. So my alert list, actually let's give it a little style first. Let's go ahead and add another CSS isolation here. We'll say new item, and we'll add a style sheet. We'll say alert list.razor.css. And just to make this look a little bit nicer, we'll drop in a little CSS isolation. I've got a cheat sheet back here, so you don't have to watch me type all of this stuff out. I'm going to paste this in, and we're going to set up a div container on our alert list with a flex box container that is a column direction. We'll have a little gap and margin there. We're going to be adding a close button too, so the CSS code for that is in here as well. So if we go back to our alert list, we need to wrap this guy in a div container. Anytime you use CSS isolation, you want to have a single root level HTML component or HTML attribute, or HTML element at the very root here, so the CSS isolation can be attached properly. That is something that you want to make sure that you have. If your CSS isn't working for some reason, check that first. And if we go back to our index page, you can see we've got the heading up here. This is, we have 25 logs, and here's all of our logs, and they have a nice space between them now thanks to the style sheet. All right, so next thing up we want to do is add a little bit of functionality that lets us remove some items from this list. Let's drop in a button. So inside of my alert box here, what we're going to put in is a button. And the button, it needs a delegate. So we have, let's go full screen on this, a little bit easier to see. So here's our button HTML code. It has a class on it. It's got the proper ARIA attributes and whatnot. It has a little span inside with an X button to click on. And then we have an onClick event. So we have @onClick. If it's an HTML attribute or element, that attribute for a delegate needs the @ symbol to differentiate between a JavaScript onClick and a Blazor framework onClick event. And these are event callbacks. So anytime you have a component that needs to trigger a re-rendering, so some event happens, we need to re-display the HTML based on some change that was made, it's going to be an event delegate. The default onClick event gives us some mouse event arguments that we don't really need to worry about, so I'm going to ignore those. And I'm going to cast that over to a delegate called handleDelete that passes in the item that is currently in scope to the for each loop. So every time an alert box renders, it's going to render a button that has that object attached to its alert button. And we need a couple of properties here to fulfill this. So the first thing I need to do is add these two properties or two methods in here. One's going to be a property, one's a method. I have my event callback that is also a T item because it's within the scope of this T item template here. So I have event callback of T item called onDelete. And this is going to be the delegate that the developer consuming this component attaches their custom code to. The handleDelete method here is going to take in the T item that was set within this for each loop. And again, we're passing in the item here as an argument. Then we're going to raise the delegate that the consumer set by calling invoke async with that item. So we're going to bubble this information up to the consumer on our index.razor page. So we need to take advantage of this new property now. And if we go over here, you can see our delete button has been rendered, but we haven't assigned a delegate to it yet. So it doesn't have any functionality yet. It's just there. Let's actually take advantage of it with a code block. And we need to specify this parameter now. We have a parameter called onDelete, and I'm going to call this one handleDelete. And over here, I want to say void handleDelete, and it is going to take in a log item as item. And then I need to do something with it. I could open up some curly braces here. This is going to be a very simple statement, so I can just throw it in a Lambda expression instead. And I can say logs.logItems.remove, and we'll just take it out of the array. Now you'll notice there's an underscore squiggly here, and this one can be kind of annoying because the message that it gives you for the error isn't very explanatory. It says argument 2 cannot be converted from method group to event callback. It's because there's a little bit of a mismatch between the parameter. If we zoom in, let's see if I can get it. There we go. It's looking for an event callback of T item, and the delegate we gave it is a delegate of log item. Doesn't quite have, the compiler doesn't quite have a way of knowing that this log item belongs to this T item that we're our generic type here. To resolve this, we can actually give the compiler a hint and say this is a log item. So T item is a log item. So now the delegate makes sense to the compiler and the error goes away. Okay. So we resolved that. If we save this, We have to reload the application here. We should be able to come in and hit delete, and you can see that we're counting down now. We can delete item 3, we delete item 6. We have 21 logs. This is what I like about Blazor. It's very simple to create UX with just some components and a few delegates here. We've got a list that we can delete items from, an account that is maintained by the service here. All very simple code. The next thing that we want to do is Thindle asked, how can we apply a CSS class based on the data that's being applied here? This is a tricky one. One of the things that we do is give the alert list a top level CSS class. We could do some kind of tricks with the item template to handle that. We could modify the alert list itself and pass some sort of value in here, or use just something in here to make this work. Depending on how you want to code this, there's a couple different routes you could take. I'm going to take my preferred route. I like functional programming. Unfortunately, not everybody does. You won't see this too many places. I think it's super handy and intuitive. Others seem to have a different opinion. But what I would like to do here is I've got some data that I want to pass under certain circumstances to my alert box. So I want to set the CSS class here based on something that the consumer in index HTML is going to specify. In this context, Fuel Snabble, the definition of functional programming I'm using is a higher order function. So a function that takes a function or returns a function as its arguments or its result. So you see these a lot in Link. But what I want to do, actually may have this on my little clipboard cheat sheet as well, so I don't have to type it all out from scratch. Let me double check here. All right, so I don't have that exact bit of code, but what I want is a parameter, and I want that parameter to be a public. This is going to be a func, so it's a function that takes a T item and returns a string. Okay, a function that takes a T item and returns a string. And I'm going to call this CSS map. And then I believe I can just default this to, let's see, this is going to be by default. Trying to remember how to word this here. Item. So I'm going to take in the T item. Oh, trying to do this from memory. It's a bit hard. Oh yeah. We're going to throw away the value if it's not set. And then we will just return alert danger. Or let's do alert info just so we can see a change here. So if I don't set the CSS map, the function is thrown away because there's nothing set here. So the default behavior is a function that doesn't take anything and returns a string. So T item in here we don't care about. We're going to give back alert info regardless of what that value would be. And we'll call the CSS class at CSS map. And then we have to pass the item to that map. So now CSS class calls the function CSS map, passes in the item. The item in this case is ignored, and we get alert info back. So we'll rebuild the application and go back. They're all blue. Okay, so the default works. So we have alert info there. Now I can go back to index razor. Let me see if I've got, there we go. You're following along. This is good. I'm going to paste this in because I actually did have this piece on the clipboard. Now I'm going to define a function that returns a string, and it takes a log item. So I have a function called CSS map. It's going to take a log item. Whatever that item is, it's going to look at the level, the log level, and run a switch statement against it. Depending on what that log level is, warning, critical, or error, it will return a string. So remember, the function, Visual Studio is not behaving. I want to pull these up side by side so we can take a quick look here. The function that we defined, or the parameter that we defined, is a function that takes a T item, so some object, returns a string. Takes T item, returns a string. CSS map takes a log item, returns a string. Okay, there's the input, there's the output. There's the input, there's the output. So we can come back up to our alert list here, and we can say CSS map at, or we don't even need the at symbol. We just say CSS map is also the function. We could make a different name here if we wanted. Let's make sure everybody knows where this is coming from. We'll call it custom CSS map. This is our custom CSS map here. And we'll save that. If we come back to our alert list, let's try to rebuild this. We've got some sort of, let's try to blow this out for a second. Seems to be stuck on, okay, build succeeded. Re-render, there we go. My map is slightly off. We've got a white background. That means one of the statements here is wrong. Is danger should be something else. We've got warning. Oh, it should be error. My bad. All right. So just a little CSS code was wrong here. We'll save that. Let's try to refresh it. There we go. So now it's coloring. There's still one that's kind of out of the loop here. Let's try to rebuild that. Warning, error, error, info. Yeah, one of these is still not correct. We want alertbox.razor. It should be danger. I did warning. Danger. Danger, error, info. That's our 3 items. There we go. So we've got blue, orange, and red. So Thindle, Fuel Snabble, and chat there. Did that make sense? So we're passing a function to our component. We're passing this custom CSS map to the CSS map property, which takes a function. When the alert list component receives that CSS map function, it goes through this for each loop, and it says CSS map passes it the item. It gets the item as a log item and passes it into the switch. The switch returns the text alert, danger, error, or info. And if we go back to the alert list, it's rendered within the alert box that is currently iterating over. And that's how you can do a map of multiple items to a CSS class. That's one of the nicest ways that I've been able to solve it. The other ways of doing it are to set a couple different properties up. one that's usually at the top level here on the top div, and then another property that can be set in the data here. And then you create a CSS class for those specific items. It gets a little bit messier, I think, that way, but I like this approach. All right. So that is, I think, everything that I have for today. It's been a good show. It's been great to have you here in chat. I just want to share real quick one more time. If you drop over to manning.com, if you want to learn more about Blazor, jump over to live projects. And in the Manning live projects, you will see a Blazor live project, Build Web Apps with Blazor. I'll paste this in chat for anybody who'd like to visit. This is a kind of, I like to describe it as like an on-the-job training experience that you get to play around with. And it is a 4-part series, teaches you how to build Blazor applications. You start off by creating a brand new Blazor WebAssembly app and attach that to a Blazor server, or you attach that to an ASP.NET server application, and you kind of join this startup in building their UI for their application. And you'll create some list-bound components like I showed today to create a user interface that has the products for the company. You'll learn how to write tests for all those components. Then you'll build like a storefront with a shopping cart and learn about state management. And then further on, you will learn how to do authentication, authenticate users, show various shopping carts and order history depending on whether that user is logged in or not. And there's mentoring by me along the way if you need help. Make sure you check that out at manning.com. Build web apps with Blazor. Other than that, I'm done for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and we will see you on Code It Live. Make sure you hit subscribe and follow on the Code It Live channel here on Twitch. And if you're watching this over on the Manning website, make sure you check out Blazor in Action by Chris Santee, along with the Build Web Apps with Blazor project. And of course, visit us over here on twitch.tv/CodeItLive as well, where we stream all sorts of .NET technology throughout the week.